Okay, so I was going to very briefly discuss some of the elements of the Vice President Biden's policy agenda that might be relevant for dollar valuation as we head towards the election and possibly beyond the election. I actually thought I would probably start with corporate tax policy rather than with the tariff premium, because I think the tariff premium feeds more directly into the buy US issue. With corporate tax, the Biden's proposed agenda is actually quite clear. The current US headline corporate tax rate is 21%. The vice president has proposed raising it to 28%. And perhaps more important, right now, the global minimum tax, which applies to the earnings US firms report in Ireland or Bermuda or any other low tax jurisdiction, is set at 10.5%. And that is proposed to go up to 21%. So it not only rises absolutely, it rises proportionately to the headline rate. There are a couple of particular additional components that could happen but haven't been explicitly laid out that would further add to the impact of the change in the global minimum. The first is right now the global minimum is defined as a tax on intangibles. So tangible assets abroad give you a deduction against your global minimum. That has been viewed by some, myself included, to be fair, as a reward for offshoring. And so to the extent the vice president intends to deliver on his making the tax code neutral or more favorable towards onshoring, that particular provision could come into question. But that hasn't been explicitly stated. I think it is implicit in some of the broader Made in All of America agenda. The second change, which would undoubtedly generate the most significant opposition, would be to make the global minimum applicable on a country-by-country basis. Right now, the global minimum is designed so that it applies to all of a US company's offshore income. So high taxes in, say, Germany can offset low taxes in Ireland. If you did it on a country-by-country basis, the only thing that would matter would be your taxes actually paid in Bermuda, Ireland, Netherlands. Pick your preferred jurisdiction, not how much you're paying in France or Germany. In statistical terms, that change has a quite important overall impact. And the third change really only affects the pharmaceutical industry, but right now, the cost of goods sold are considered a deduction from revenue and therefore don't impact the base erosion and anti-abuse tax provisions. And it is possible that that particular provision could be removed, in which case some of the base erosion provisions in the tax code would start to bite for pharmaceutical companies that use transfer pricing based on the price of active pharmaceuticals. Directionally, all this is a simple translation into foreign exchange space. It should make US equities less attractive and therefore, at the margin, contribute to dollar weakness. A couple of sub-points here. These tax hikes are not intended as to be part of a fiscal consolidation plan, which would impact some of the fiscal forecasts that Chris and Jens discussed. These taxes are the intended source of long-term pay-fors for expansions in government spending, particularly expansions in healthcare spending and increased support for childcare. I think there would likely be pressure to also have additional recovery packages depending on where the US economy is in the first year of Biden administration. Certainly the intellectual consensus amongst Democratic-leaning economists is that the Obama administration made an error in pulling back too quickly on the fiscal stimulus in 2010 and 2011. So there would, I think, be pressure to maintain a relatively expansionary fiscal stance. Second point is tariff uncertainty. And directionally, there is no question that tariff uncertainty would go down with a Biden presidency. Less to do with Biden, more to do with not being Trump. But the general gist would be to rely much more on traditional trade remedies, your standard safeguards, countervailing duties, the stuff that goes through judicial processes, and not to rely on rather arbitrary national security tariffs like the 232. I think this is particularly important vis-a-vis Europe, given the vice president's very clear signaling that he would like to strengthen alliances and cooperation with America's traditional and democratic allies. And obviously the 232 tariff is on autos in particular were seen as a slap in the face to America's European allies. And they were treated as national security threats when they did not see themselves as such. I think there's actually a little bit of a potential for a positive surprise in the sense that you could imagine, and I'm not saying it's definite, but you could imagine one trade initiative in a Biden administration being an attempt to clear the decks with Europe and settle a range of issues, including the longstanding Boeing-Airbus dispute, as part of a broader policy to renew America's alliances. I think that's more likely than any immediate renewal of trade negotiations. Flip side on all that is the vice president has actually announced a very clear commitment to an aggressive Buy America plan. The commitment is not only to enforce existing laws without using any of the exemptions that have in effect allowed the U.S. government to buy Chinese assembled computers without running into Buy America provisions. The commitment is to deliver $400 billion of federal purchases to U.S. goods over 4 years, so about $100 billion a year. If you want to try to scale that, I think it's helpful to note that works out to about 40 basis points of GDP, 0.4% of US GDP. And some fraction of that would have been purchases that would have gone to US companies, no matter what the actual policy of the administration. So in terms of the net impact, I get numbers that are more comparable to the very first round of, if you want to do it in tariff equivalents or something like that, to the very first round of tariffs on China at 50 billion, not numbers that are comparable to the escalated 250 billion tariffs that became a big issue for the market. But for specific sectors, clean energy, pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, a lot of infrastructure related sectors, the Buy America provisions, if they are implemented, could be a fairly significant change in US policy. If you want to interpret them as a form of soft protectionism and you think the exchange rate offsets, then to use the tariff framework, that would be a modest dollar positive. The last thing, and I'm going to be very brief on this, is the Biden administration's policy towards China. Obviously, there's no more important bilateral relationship in the world. My general observation is that in the last two Democratic administrations, one of the most consequential discussions in the first year was around the evolution of policy towards China. There are competing and conflicting views within the Democratic Party on policy towards China, just as there are competing and conflicting views within the Republican Party on China. It is unlikely, in my view, that those differences will be fully resolved in the campaign, in large part because the issue of China can be handled in the campaign largely by pointing to Trump's trade policy and pointing out how it has not delivered its promises. Purchases will fall well short of the target, and you can define that as failure without having to identify explicitly what you are for. The vice president does have a long-standing relationship with President Xi. The New York Times story I thought was accurate there. He was the envoy that Obama sent to meet Xi when they were both vice presidents. The personal connection is certainly a part of Biden's DNA, is sort of the George Herbert Walker Bush approach to foreign policy, pick up the phone and talk to people. But the political pressures on any administration towards a tougher policy are very real. And within the Democratic Party, those come not just from those who believe that the economic relationship needs rebalancing, but also importantly from those who are concerned about human rights, democracy, Hong Kong, Uyghurs, and the like. And I think that would set a limit on any move to go back to the pre-Trump status quo. But there will be an effort, presumably, to look for those areas where cooperation is possible amid an overall context marked by deeper competition, and the most obvious there is climate. But the balance there is always difficult to know, and really, I think, will depend importantly on policy decisions that are made after the election.